After flying into Bao'an Airport in the city of Shintun on June 6, 1994, a businessman identified as Xie Mo went to pick up his rental car. Getting into the vehicle, he was approached by an attractive young woman dressed somewhat revealingly for the time. The young woman asked the businessman if it was possible she could get a ride to her destination. Ever the gentleman, Xie Mo told her to jump in. Along the way, the young woman asked him if he'd like a massage after his long tiring journey. Knowing what his passenger was really offering, he happily accepted. On entering the massage room, the businessman immediately felt something was off. The whole atmosphere felt strange. The woman told him to make himself comfortable while she went to freshen herself up. She turned some music on as she left the room, but Xie Mo knew he needed to get out of there. As he tried to leave, a gang of men entered and began viciously beating him about the head. Outnumbered, the businessman fought for his life, somehow managed to get to a window and jumped out. Fortunately for Xie Mo, the room was on the ground floor of the building. Adrenaline pumping through his body, he managed to ignore any pain he felt and ran to his car. As he hit the gas and drove away, he saw his attackers try to chase him down, but they soon gave up when the businessman floored it. He kept driving until the pain from the head injuries he'd suffered caught up with him, stopping the car before passing out. Passers-by found him bleeding and unconscious and called an ambulance. He didn't know it at the time, but businessman Xie Mo would be the only survivor of a criminal gang that police believed were responsible for at least 17 deaths in the Guangdong province cities of Shintun and Dongguan. The case becoming notorious for the gang, including 6 women who would become known as the Witches of Shenzhen. Once sufficiently recovered to tell medical staff how he'd received his injuries, the police were called to speak with him. This put the businessman in a delicate position. He knew full well the woman he allowed to get in the car wasn't only offering a massage, and that could cause him problems with police. He gave them a description of the woman, and told them much of the story, but claimed he couldn't remember the exact location of the house she'd directed him to. He did at least confirm police suspicions that victims were being approached by women at or near the airport. And for the first time, they now had a witness who could potentially identify a suspect. They began staking out the airport, looking for young attractive women dressed in a way that was sure to grab the attention of men. On June 26, undercover officers spotted a woman who fit the bill. She was hanging around outside the arrivals hall, her clothing making her stand out among the crowds. Police felt she closely matched the description of the individual whom Xie Mo had described. They watched the woman as she approached a man getting into a Toyota Camry, rather than going to the available taxis. The driver pulled away with the suspect as a passenger. Officers began following the vehicle. Inside the car, the woman asked the driver if he was interested in a massage, as a thank you for the lift. When police lights started flashing in the man's rearview mirror and he was being directed to pull over, the driver began to panic, believing he'd been caught out by a police sting operation. The panic was replaced by a mix of relief and confusion when the officers arrested his female passenger. The woman in her early 20s was surprisingly calm when arrested, openly admitting that she was just soliciting men at the airport. She gave her name as Zhong Xiaoming and claimed to be from Guiyang, a city in the province of Guizhou. She told police she was working as a massage girl in Shintun and was just looking for customers before being arrested. She didn't have any ID on her to prove she was who she claimed, so police asked her to speak in the local dialect of Guiyang. When she was unable to do so, police began asking her questions about the string of carjackings they'd been investigating over the past year. Despite her young age, the woman was remarkably difficult for interrogators to crack. She maintained her story for 8 hours before finally admitting the truth. She broke down in tears and confessed. Her real name was Liu Yuxiang and was from Ganzhou, a city in Jiangxi province. She'd arrived in Shintun 6 months previously, having found a job in a factory making speakers. That was until she met a man by the name of Qiu Dexi and his friends. A year earlier, on the 15th of July 1993, a lychee farmer in Shanghe, a village in the Shintun district of Bao'an, called police to inform them he'd discovered a body in one of his orchards. Summers in the region are very hot and humid. The body was well into the process of decomposition, suggesting it had been there for several days. On arriving at the scene, police believed that the body was that of a taxi driver identified as Zhang Mo, who'd been reported as missing 10 days prior by both his family and employer. The last known whereabouts of the driver was 32 kilometers to the north, in the neighboring city of Dongguan. He picked up a young couple outside the Oriental Hotel, then vanished. When he failed to return his cab to hand over to the next driver on shift, his boss called his family to see if they'd seen him. His family said he hadn't returned home. This was strange for the usually reliable Zhang Mo, so the police were called. There was no sign of a taxi at the scene, and any money the victim had been carrying was gone. Police transported the body to the nearest medical facility and called the wife of Zhang Mo to come in to identify it. On being handed the victim's clothes, she knew it was her husband and broke down. When examining the body, police found the victim had a nylon rope tied around his neck. Duct tape had been placed over his nose and mouth, which had been gagged with a ball of wire wool. This was the third such case in the past 3 months where a driver had been found dead and his vehicle stolen. Unfortunately for taxi driver Zhang Mo, the young couple he picked up that evening were Zhang Xiaojian and his girlfriend Fu Hongqiong. In March of 1993, Zhang Xiaojian, his younger brother Zhang Xiaopo, along with close friends Chen Weixiang and Zhang Chuqiang, left a nightclub with near-empty pockets. The quartet were working on a factory production line doing long hours for low wages, and they'd now spent most of their monthly salary. While trying to flag down a taxi to take them back to their factory accommodation, they lamented the fact they were already out of money and had weeks to go before they next got paid. Zhang Xiaopo half-jokingly suggested they steal a car. Their monthly salary was only around 200 RMB, and he knew someone who bought stolen cars for thousands. His older brother and Chen Weixiang took the comment seriously, and figured the risk was more than worth the reward. As the quartet entered the taxi unlucky enough to stop for them, they had already made up their minds. They directed the driver to a quiet, remote area of the city. Along the way, Zhang Xiaojian pulled out a knife and held it to the driver, telling him they were going to take his vehicle. Once at the destination, they ordered the driver to stop and the quartet began to discuss what to do with him. The driver'd seen their faces, and for a robbery like this, they would be facing a minimum prison sentence of 10 years. They made the choice to leave no witnesses, so the driver had to be taken care of. Picking up a rock from the ground, Zhang Xiaojian smashed it into the driver's head repeatedly, knocking the man unconscious. Believing he was dead, they dragged the body to a nearby pond. The driver suddenly came to and begged for his life, telling the men to just take the car, and saying he wouldn't report them to the police. Zhang Xiaojian smashed him in the head with the rock again to shut him up. They threw what they thought was a dead body into the pond, but once again the driver woke up. As he struggled in the water, Zhang Xiaojian, frustrated, went into the pond and ended the driver's life with his knife. They then drove the taxi to their hometown in Meizhou, another city in the province of Guangdong, some 350 kilometers from Shenzhen, and to the contact of Zhang Xiaopo. The area where the two brothers came from had a fairly well-established black market for stolen vehicles at the time. Despite noticing bloodstains on the taxicab's interior, the dealer was still willing to take it, and paid the men 10,000 RMB. With their production line salary being 200 a month at most, this was an almost unimaginable amount for a single night's work. The four young men took full advantage of having full wallets for the first time in their lives, quitting their jobs, going out to nightclubs, eating expensive meals, gambling, and getting massages with special extras, but before long the money was gone. The quartet decided to strike again. 2 months later, in the May of 1993, they flagged down a taxi and told the driver where to head. However, this time they found an obstacle. Word of a driver going missing had spread along the taxi driver grapevine, and this time their cabbie was much more vigilant, questioning why 4 young men wanted to go to an unusual location. Once the driver agreed to allow them in the vehicle, after they promised to pay extra, he soon had a knife being held to his stomach. They ordered him to drive out to a remote area, then choked him to death and left his body out in the hills on the outskirts of the city, which would eventually be found days later. Again they received 10,000 RMB for the vehicle, but realized that it was only going to get more difficult to convince drivers to let them in the cabs as time went on, if more drivers ended up missing. It was around this time Zhang Xiaojian came up with the idea of convincing his girlfriend Fu Hongqiong to join the operation. His thinking was simple: if drivers were picking up a man and woman, they'd be less wary, and the other members of the gang could wait at an agreed location to deal with the driver when the time came. 19-year-old Fu Hongqiong had come to Shintun to work in a factory shortly after finishing high school. She came from a village on the outskirts of Bijie, a city in Guizhou province. She'd met Zhang Xiaojian shortly after he'd committed the first carjacking and was flush with money. After the first robbery, the four men were living off the proceeds of their crime and had rented a house together. He managed to pass himself off as a successful businessman to the young and somewhat naive woman, spending lavishly to impress her. He would tell her that she could quit her job and that he'd take care of her financially once they started a relationship, something that Fu Hongqiong happily agreed with. On the 5th of July 1993, Zhang Xiaojian had treated Fu Hongqiong to a meal at the Oriental Hotel in Dongguan. In front of the hotel after the meal, Zhang Xiaojian asked her to hail a cab, and the taxi driven by Zhang Mo pulled up. The young couple got in, but halfway through the journey, Zhang Xiaojian told her he had some business to take care of. He asked her to get out of the cab and wait for him to come back for her while he did what he needed to do. She did as asked, but when he returned in the taxi and the driver was missing, she was a touch confused. She questioned him about the driver as Zhang Xiaojian drove. He didn't hold anything back, coldly explaining that he and his colleagues had ended the driver's life, and he was now going to sell the vehicle, telling her this is how he made money. Police now had 3 drivers going missing, turning up dead, and their vehicles stolen in the space of 4 months. But the investigation had little to go on. There was no physical evidence at the scenes the bodies were found. There was little CCTV on the roads at that time, and apart from other drivers seeing a young couple getting into the cab of Zhang Mo, no eyewitnesses. With the taxi cabs gone, police had no way of knowing the last time any of the drivers accepted a passenger, or where pickups occurred. While people had seen a young couple getting into the cab of Zhang Mo, it couldn't be said for certain that they were his last fare. Taxi companies in the city responded to the drivers' deaths by increasing the security of the cabs. Bars were installed to protect drivers, who were now often unwilling to allow customers to sit in the passenger seat. The increased security of the cabs, drivers being more cautious about who they picked up, and advice from the man fencing the stolen vehicles would lead to the gang changing their targets. The fence told the gang that there were plenty of people in other major cities like Shanghai, willing to pay much more for high-end vehicles. Living in Shenzhen, the gang would have plenty of opportunity to make some real money. It is almost mandatory when talking about Shenzhen to mention that the city was little more than a tiny anonymous fishing village 40 years ago. Today, it is a massive modern metropolis, with a population close to 18 million people, and is described as China's Silicon Valley. Due to its location on the south coast, and close proximity to Hong Kong, in the 1980s as part of the country's opening up reforms, it was declared as the site for China's first special economic zone, which would practice market capitalism, of course with Chinese characteristics. It amalgamated surrounding counties as it began to develop, with businesses from Hong Kong, Taiwan and overseas investing heavily in the city, setting up production bases in the area. This saw an army of migrant workers flooding into the region from all over the country, to fill the numerous factory and construction jobs that were on offer as the city developed. People coming to the city would have to apply for a permit to work there, showing proof of employment and accommodation, which were dormitories provided by the employers. The workforce from poor rural villages were hoping to earn enough money for their families, many sending the bulk of their salaries back to their parents. The working conditions, however, were not good. Workers were forced to do long hours, salaries often being only 100 or 200 RMB a month, and they were expected to do overtime for no extra pay. Bosses would fine workers for only minor issues. Being 5 minutes late could see them docked an entire day's salary. Some employers at times would simply refuse to pay workers. The police in the city were especially strict with the migrants. If a worker was caught outside the grounds of their employer without their ID and proof of employment, they could be held in detention until someone came to vouch for them. As the city developed and money flooded in, it also saw illegitimate business rise, and criminal gangs, both mainland and Hong Kong triads, were there to take full advantage of the wealth swirling round Shenzhen. With the population exploding from only 300,000 people in 1979 to close to 3.5 million by 1993, entertainment venues thrived, many of them providing services that, while not legal, a blind eye was often turned. Gambling parlors and brothels sprung up all over the city for both the migrant workforce and the rich businessmen setting up company bases. A byproduct of the wealth coming into Shenzhen was the sight of, what for China at the time, were high-end imported vehicles. Mercedes-Benz, Lexuses, Audis were now common sights on the roads. Even Toyotas were considered luxury cars well out of the price range of most residents. There was a lot of money to be made by anyone willing to take the risk of stealing them. The man fencing the stolen taxicabs had told the gang that if they got their hands on imported brands, he could easily sell them for hundreds of thousands, rather than the tens of thousands the gang had previously received. The figures were eye-watering for a group of people who'd grown up in poor rural villages, and they set about getting their hands on the higher-end brands. Zhang Xiaojie and the rest began formulating their plans. Hostess work was widespread in Shintun. Many young women who came to the city to work in factories were often enticed or forced into working in brothels. Some found the higher amount of money they could earn to support their families far too good to turn down. Others would be offered work in factories, only to find their jobs were actually in karaoke bars, massage parlors, or hotels once they arrived to start their employment. The criminal gangs who scammed the women would hold their ID cards and use physical violence to control them, leaving the women little choice but to do as they were told. The Sin City-style reputation Shenzhen had built was an attraction for men with money to visit the city, not only to do business but to enjoy the company of the so-called factory girls. Zhang Xiaojie was only too aware of this, and knew the airport could be fertile hunting ground. Knowing businessmen were flying into the city, not only to do business, but also take advantage of the female attractions. He'd get a woman to approach targets with an offer, and once they were in the home the gang were renting they'd take care of the victim and have the car. He expanded membership of the gang, more men joining, largely extended family members, and more importantly for the scheme, their wives, girlfriends or sisters. The sister of Zhang Xiaojie and Zhang Xiaopo, 23-year-old Zhang Xiaofeng, would join her brothers, along with her husband Chen Jingde, after they told her how much money they stood to make. They were also joined by the 23-year-old wife of Zhang Xiaopo, Xie Xiuyun. Fu Hongqiong would also get her family involved, convincing her older sister, 23-year-old Fu Limin, to join after showing off the lifestyle she was enjoying in Shenzhen. On the 17th of August 1993, a driver for the Taxation and Finance Bureau of the Longgang district of Shenzhen was told to go to the airport and pick up the wife of the head of the department. The driver, referred to as Wu Mo, was driving a brand new black Audi belonging to the bureau. He headed to the airport in plenty of time to meet the plane, but perhaps leaving him too much time to kill. As he waited, 3 women approached the car and told him they worked at a brothel not too far away if he felt like a massage from all 3 of them. Unable to resist the offer, he headed to the home. Once there, the women told him to get comfortable on a massage table while they got themselves ready. Leaving the room, one turned the radio on to play some music. As it played, the male members of the gang led by Zhang Xiaojie entered the room and attacked the driver. As the other men held him down, Zhang Xiaojie placed a wire round the driver's throat and choked him to death. While this was happening, Fu Hongqiong walked in, and for the first time witnessed her boyfriend ending someone's life. Once the driver was dead, the gang moved his body to the Audi and dumped it in a sewerage well on the highway out of the city. The Audi earned the gang close to 100,000 RMB, an astronomical amount, and they would become much more active, greedy to make more. The body of Wu Mo would be discovered a week after being reported as missing by his employers, after he failed to pick up his passenger. Only the following month, in September, they entrapped their next victim. The general manager of a large company, referred to as Chen Mo, was driving back to Shintun from his hometown in the province of Jiangxi in his brand new Lexus. Getting close to the airport, he decided to wash off the grime that had accumulated on the vehicle on the long drive. He was spotted by the women, and a similar scene to their last crime played out. Waiting for his car, 3 women approached offering a special massage, which he accepted. Once in the home, he was told to make himself comfortable, while his woman of choice left to freshen up. Before leaving the room, she turned some music on, giving the gang the cue to enter and end the man's life. Again, the gang received around 100,000 RMB for the vehicle. When he didn't return to his home in Shenzhen that evening, the wife of the man contacted the police and reported him as missing. His body was discovered 5 days later, hidden on a fruit orchard on the outskirts of the city. The police were left largely clueless, There was no physical evidence at any of the scenes the bodies were discovered, there were no eyewitnesses, and they were unable to track down any of the stolen cars. Between the September of 1993 and the March of 1994, at least 10 other people would go missing from areas close to the airport. However, the bodies of the suspected victims either wouldn't be discovered until many years later, or never found. The next confirmed case happened on March 6, 1994. The gang now had a fifth female member, 19-year-old Wen Yana, who was introduced to the group by another new member, Qiu Dexi. Around this time, they had also added a new tactic to their criminal enterprise. While the women were still vital in entrapping the victims, some of the gang members were now wearing fake police uniforms and using a police vehicle they'd bought from their fence. The disguise made it easier for them to now deal with their victims, without having to take them back to the home. The women would still approach targets at the airport or flag them down on the roads leading to it. Once in the vehicle, the usual negotiation would take place, then the fake police officers would pull them over, the drivers panicking at being caught with the women in the car. Not wanting their wives or girlfriends to find out what they'd done and avoid arrest, the drivers would offer a bribe of whatever money they could get their hands on, which would be gratefully accepted. The fake officers would then end the victim's life, usually by strangulation, then dunk the body in the wooded hills. This was the fate that befell a construction company director, identified as Duomo. His Mitsubishi Jeep fetching the gang over 100,000 RMB. Just weeks later, on the 22nd of March, the scheme would be successful again. A man identified as Imo, who worked for the Industrial Commercial Bureau in the city, was stopped and had his life ended by the fake police officers. His body again dumped in an isolated location in the hills around the city. The Mercedes-Benz he was driving earning the gang over 200,000 RMB. People who often used the airport were fully aware that men were going missing from the area after letting young scantily clad women into their cars. Men became more wary and started thinking with their heads, rather than other parts of their body. Police had also managed to figure out the gang scheme, but got little help identifying potential suspects. Due to a general distrust of the police, and concerns that they would be falsely implicated, drivers weren't keen on talking to them. With a more obvious police presence at the airport, and drivers' increased vigilance, the gang wanted new recruits who wouldn't be familiar faces at their hunting ground. Soon enough, the sixth of the women to become known as one of the Shintun witches joined after meeting gang member Qiu Dexi. Qiu Dexi was becoming something of a recruiter for the gang, having already brought Wen Yana into the fold. He then met Liu Yuxiang and charmed her. Like Wen Yana, Liu Yuxiang was more of an outsider, neither woman being closely tied to the other members of the gang. Not long after meeting Qiu Dexi and starting a relationship with him, she was introduced to the other members. He invited her to move into the house with him, but she soon found out she'd be expected to pull her weight. He explained how he and the others made their money, but assured her they only blackmailed the victims and stole their cars before letting them go. Seeing the comfortable life they had, she chose to believe him and take part in the robberies. However, a combination of people's increased concern about the vanishing drivers and her own lack of confidence in approaching men caused her to fail the first time she was sent out to entrap someone. Shortly after this, she'd find out what the group were really doing. She overheard an argument about the split of the money, Qiu Dexi mentioning disposing of a body. When she asked her boyfriend about what she overheard, he told her not to worry about it, they'd already ended the lives of a lot of people. The second time she was sent out to entrap a driver, she had more success, even though she now knew she was leading the man to his death. The car she got into was being driven by Xiemo, who managed to escape the game, albeit with serious head injuries. Until she got involved, everything had been smooth sailing for the game, but despite the apparent bad luck Liu Yuxiang was bringing them, they sent her out again. And it was her third attempt when the car was stopped by real police. She was arrested, and after a long interrogation, would eventually confess her involvement. Her 8 hours stalling before she finally admitted the truth had tipped the gang off and given them time to go to ground. When she didn't turn up where she was supposed to, the rest of the group immediately assumed the police had found her and left the area ASAP. They largely chose to head back to their hometowns in Meizhou, Bijie, and Guiyang to lie low. Liu Yuxiang gave the police the names of the 5 other women, and as many of the names of the men as she knew, along with any other information she could. With suspects' names and their hometowns, police used the paperwork of people from those locations to look for individuals who'd applied for a permit to work in Shenzhen. It took police 2 months to track down and arrest the 15 members of the gang who'd attempted to go into hiding. The suspects, all aged between the ages of 26 and 19, collectively confessed to 17 intentional homicides, and were found to have made close to 6.5 million RMB from their crimes. Some of the vehicles would be recovered as evidence after the arrests, others, like a number of their victims, would never be found. The arrests received a lot of attention from the public and the media, with most of the focus being placed on the women who enticed the victims to their deaths. Despite being one of the youngest women, Fu Hongqiong was considered as the older sister of the gang, due to her being the first to become involved, and being the girlfriend of Zhang Xiaojian. She confessed to being directly involved in 6 of the homicides, and that she helped train the other women in how to seduce the victims. However, in her confession she would claim that she'd been forced into it by her boyfriend Zhang Xiaojian, after the first incident in which she was involved, the death of Zhang Mo. She told police that after Zhang Xiaojian informed her of what he'd done to the driver, she wanted to leave, but he took her ID card and wouldn't allow her access to it. At that time in the country, if a person needed to get a new ID card, they had to apply for a replacement in the area of their household registration, and traveling without identification came with a risk of punishment. Furthermore, he told her if she went to the police, he'd tell them she took an active part in the robbery and she'd go to jail with him. She spoke about the first time she witnessed the death of one of their victims, and how she wanted to run away, but still felt forced to continue, her boyfriend becoming angry and violent towards her if she didn't do as he wanted. She claimed that she feared for her life if she didn't follow orders. Police found her claims somewhat questionable, as she'd told her older sister to come to Shenzhen and join the gang. They found it hard to believe that if Fu Hongqiong was genuinely being coerced and was in fear for her life, that she would choose to place her sister into the same danger. Her sister Fu Limin was also found to have only taken an active part in a single robbery, which only brought the claims of Fu Hongqiong that she was being forced to participate further into question. The confession of one of the other women involved was very different. The wife of Zhang Xiaopo, Xie Xiuyun, had a much colder attitude to what the gang did. She told police that she believed a man without money was worthless, and that she didn't actually have to end anyone's life herself, so didn't care if their victims lived or died, and the deaths were nothing to do with her. When asked by interrogators how they seduced the victims, she said they didn't have to make much effort. They just told the men what they did and the victims were more than happy to go to their place. Her husband, and the man who planted the seeds of the scheme, Zhang Xiaopo, was one of the few gang members who showed remorse. He told the officers interviewing him that after the first carjacking and ending the driver's life, he was scared, thinking things wouldn't go so far. His brother and the other men with him at the time told him not to worry about it, and that it wasn't a big deal. However, after getting the money for the vehicle, his fears soon dissipated, and he had no issues doing it again. While criminal trials in the country are often held fairly soon after confessions are given, even more so in the past, there was a delay of just over a year in this case. In total, the gang had confessed to 17 intentional homicides, but many of their victims to that point hadn't been found, and in those instances they were still on police files as missing person cases. Police needed time to investigate the confessions and attempt to find the victims' remains. A public trial for the gang would finally be held on October 25, 1995. All 16 members of the gang tried at the same time. They were each facing a variety of charges, including intentional injury, robbery, selling stolen goods, and intentional homicide. The leader of the gang, Zhang Xiaojian, and his younger brother Zhang Xiaopo, were found guilty of all charges along with the other 2 original members of the gang, Chen Weixiang and Zhang Chuqiang, the 4 men being given a death sentence. Fu Hongqiong was found guilty of taking part in 6 of the robbery homicides, and would also be handed the death penalty. The wife of Zhang Xiaopo, Xie Xiuyun, was found guilty of participating in 5 intentional homicides and was sentenced to death. Zhang Xiaofeng, the sister of the Zhang brothers, and her husband Chen Jingde, both received the death penalty for participation in 4 intentional homicides. Qiu Dexi and 19-year-old Wen Yana, the youngest member of the gang, were found guilty on 4 counts of intentional homicide and were sentenced to death. While only being found guilty of participating in one of the robbery homicides, the sister of Fu Hongqiong, Fu Limin, would also be handed a death sentence. The woman who eventually exposed the gang after her arrest, Liu Yuxiang, would be given a 20-year prison sentence for her participation. The man fencing the stolen vehicles would only receive a 3-year prison sentence for his part in the crimes, and 4 other gang members were handed death sentences for their role in the various homicides. After the verdicts were handed down, several of the gang lodged appeals against their sentences. The only successful appeal was that of Fu Limin. The court decided that as she'd only taken direct part in one of the homicides, her death sentence would be suspended for 2 years, with the possibility of it being commuted to a light sentence. In the past, it was common in big cases such as this, where multiple criminals were going to be executed, authorities would make a public display of announcing the punishments. Today it will still happen, generally in major drug trafficking cases, but is less common. It was felt that by making the convicted face the public when handing out the death sentences, it would show people what happens to criminals in the country, warning people, you will be caught and punished if you commit a crime, as well as publicly shaming the offenders. The gang would be part of such a display on December 15, 1995, once the appeals process was over. Under heavy armed guard, all 16 members of the gang were driven through the streets of Shintun in open-topped vehicles to the Xi'an Sports Stadium to hear their sentences read out. A crowd of around 20,000 people braved the heavy rain to watch the spectacle. A temporary stage had been constructed in front of the stadium's grandstand especially for the show trial, and the 16 gang members were marched onto it by armed police to face the audience and the gathered news crews broadcasting the event across the region. On stage, each gang member was brought forward to face the crowd one by one, as their names were read out, along with the offenses they'd been convicted of, and the sentences they'd received. Some of the convicted looked down at the ground, trying to hide their faces from the crowd in shame. Others showed fear about the fate they would soon be facing, but there were also some who seemed to show defiance as they were brought forward. When the performance was completed, the gang members were placed back into the open-top trucks and taken away to face their punishments. Liu Yuxiang, Fu Limin, and the man who fenced the stolen vehicles were transported straight to jail to begin their sentences, while those who received death sentences were taken directly to what would be the site of their execution. 13 of the 16 members of the gang would be executed by firing squad. News crews tried to film the event from a distance, but their view would be obscured by thick mist from the heavy rain. Only a year later, the case would be made into the Hong Kong movie, Liu Mo Nu, or Six Witches. The case served more as inspiration for the film, as opposed to it being a wholly accurate retelling of the case, and it does tend to focus on the physical attributes of its female stars. While it is difficult to find any concrete information about the fates of both Fu Limin and Liu Yuxiang, it is believed that Liu Yuxiang served her sentence and was released in 2015, and Fu Limin, who had her death sentence suspended, had her punishment reduced to life in prison and remains incarcerated to this day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.